Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sachs, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming out this morning. It's really nice seeing some familiar faces in the crowd. So today, I'm going to be talking about my senior thesis project. A lot of what we do in the Sachs lab is dedicated to understanding the neurobiological mechanisms that contribute to mental disorders like depression and anxiety and substance use disorders. And so my project is trying to look a little bit into those brain-behavior relationships. And so specifically in my senior thesis, I assessed the impact of repeated amphetamine exposure on stress susceptibility and gene expression. So to give a little bit of background information, it's fairly common for substance use disorders and mental disorders like depression and anxiety to co-occur in an individual. There was a survey that was done in 2022 that found that 21.5 million US adults were living with a co-occurring disorder. So even though there are very high rates of comorbidity between SUDs and mental disorders, there's not much understanding of the causal relationships between the two. Amphetamine is also a common stimulant prescription medication. So Adderall is actually an example of an amphetamine. And there are over 30 million Americans who are prescribed amphetamine to treat their ADHD each year. So an amphetamine-induced increase in stress susceptibility has potential to impact a large number of people. A lot of neuroscience research on stress susceptibility often uses males as the model, but a number of clinical studies do show that women are almost twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety than males. And there was a paper from 2015 that showed in response to a variable stress paradigm, females developed depressive and anxiety-like behavior, but males were actually resilient to that stress. There was also a paper in 2011 that showed that repeated exposure to cocaine, which is a similar stimulant to amphetamine, caused an increase in stress susceptibility in male mice. And so these two papers kind of served as a jumping point and really inspired my research. Knowing that cocaine was able to increase anxiety and depressive-like in male mice, and also knowing that clinically females are generally more likely to be diagnosed with depression and anxiety, I was really interested on what would happen if we kind of bring females into the equation and looking at the impact of drug use on stress susceptibility. And so this brings me to my research question, which is how does repeated amphetamine use impact stress susceptibility in the sexes? And so I would say I have a twofold hypothesis. First, I hypothesized that females would be more susceptible to stress than males. And second, I thought that amphetamine would increase stress susceptibility in one or both of the sexes. So we can divide my project, I guess, into two experimental aims. So first, I conducted a behavioral study, and then following that, I developed my molecular analysis. So we'll start with the behavioral side. So I started off with 7 days of injections of either saline or amphetamine. Following that, we did a 3-day stress paradigm. And we decided to do a milder stress paradigm so that if we saw amphetamine was increasing the severity of anxiety and depressive-like behavior, we'd be able to see that and also measure that. And then following stress, we did 4 days of behavioral testing. So for my behavioral tests, this was adapted from a previous paper, and we used light-dark emergence test, elevated plus maze, forced swim test, and the novelty suppressed feeding test. So if we were to see pro-anxiety behavior following stress in mice, we would expect a mouse to spend less time in the light in LDE and also travel a shorter distance in LDE. We would also expect a more anxious mouse to spend less time in the open arms in elevated plus maze and also have a higher latency to feed and novelty suppressed feeding. In terms of the forced swim test, this assesses stress coping strategies. So active stress coping would be when the mouse is swimming very actively, versus going immobile would be a passive stress coping strategy. So, to remind you of my hypotheses, I thought that females would be more susceptible to stress than males, and I thought that amphetamine would increase stress susceptibility in one or both of the sexes. So in the light-dark emergence test, we saw that neither of these hypotheses were fully supported. We saw that the 3-day stress was insufficient to change behavior, and we also saw that amphetamine did not increase stress susceptibility. However, even though the data was not significant, we did see a trend that suggested that women, or the female, were more susceptible to the stress, and they were showing more of a stress response than the males. And you can see this because there was a reduction in the time that they were spending in the light, and there was also a reduction in the distance that they were traveling in the light. And so this would be consistent with my first hypothesis. However, it's not significant. For the elevated plus maze, we found that stress and amphetamine were differentially impacting the sexes. So I think what's most striking here is we saw that the stress was actually having an anti-anxiety effect in the males, and there was a slight pro-anxiety effect in the females. And I say that lightly because, again, that was not significant, but it was a trend in that stress response. So here we can see that the stress was impacting the males less than it was impacting the females, which is generally consistent with my first hypothesis. In terms of the effect of amphetamine, we saw that the drug did not impact the male's behavior, but we did see that amphetamine increased locomotor activity and exploratory drive in the females. And we can see this because they spent more time in the open arm, but also they were just, in general, traveling a further distance in response to the drug. However, this data does not support my second hypothesis that amphetamine would increase stress susceptibility. However, we are seeing differences between the sexes. In terms of the novelty-suppressed feeding, we see here that the stress and amphetamine also were differentially impacting the sexes. Stress had no effect on the sexes in the saline-treated animals. We also see that following amphetamine, there was actually a reduction or an anti-anxiety effect in the females. However, amphetamine did increase the stress response in the females only. We can see this because of the increase in the feeding latency. And so this would offer some support for my second hypothesis, that amphetamine was increasing stress susceptibility, and here we see that in the females. And then lastly, for my behavioral test, we did the forced swim. Here we see that both of the sexes were impacted by the stress paradigm, and they were traveling a shorter distance in the water. So we don't see support for my first hypothesis that females would be more impacted by the stress. We do see that amphetamine was impacting stress coping in females. So we see that amphetamine itself had an antidepressant effect, and then following stress, there was a reduction in that effect, and that was only seen in the females. And so here we have some support for my second hypothesis, because amphetamine is affecting the stress response. So for a summary for my behavioral results, we see that neither of my hypotheses were fully supported across my tests. We do see that both the drug and stress are impacting the mice behaviorally, and often this is happening in different ways. It's having different impacts, but it's really not as clear-cut as I originally thought and originally hypothesized at the beginning of my study. But I do think that the results highlight the complexity of the stress response. I also think it highlights the importance of looking at both sexes, because if we were to only have looked at males, we would have come to very different conclusions. So now moving on to the second part of my study, which is the molecular piece. I was assessing how amphetamine was changing the molecular response to stress in the sexes. To do this, I did real-time PCR. And so we started by starting a new cohort of mice, and then we collected brain tissue from the hippocampus and the central nucleus of the amygdala following the final stressor. After that, we isolated the RNA, we reverse transcribed, and then we did real-time PCR, which is a technique to quantify the expression of a gene, and then we could see how that was different across the treatment groups. And for this, I looked at FKBP5, which is a binding protein that's involved in the stress response. I looked at NR3C1, which is a glucocorticoid receptor, also involved in the stress response. And then we looked at cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript. So we did see some differences in expression in the hippocampus. We saw that FKBP5, there was a reduction in expression following stress. We also see in NR3C1, which is the glucocorticoid receptor, that males just had higher levels of the glucocorticoid receptor than females. But here, there was no impact of the drug. In CART, however, which is the cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript, we did see that the drug was affecting gene expression in a sex-specific way. So you can see in the saline treatment groups, males just generally had a higher level of the cocaine and amphetamine regulated transcript. And then in the males only, after the drug, there was a reduction. So gene expression was changing and only in males. So what we can conclude from these molecular studies, if my hypotheses were supported in my behavioral studies, it would be a lot easier to know what to expect and what we could predict would be happening kind of underneath the surface. But given how complex my behavioral results were, and the fact that neither of my hypotheses were fully supported across the tests, it makes it a little bit more complex to analyze the molecular data. However, we are seeing that stress is impacting gene expression. We're seeing that the drug is impacting gene expression in a sex-specific way. And we're seeing similar things happening in the behavioral results. So this leads me to believe that these factors are important in the stress response. However, it's just far more complex than I thought. So for future directions, I think that we could repeat the experiment and see if any of those trends we were seeing would become significant. I also think we could extend the behavioral tests to explore a few more things. And then finally, I think that we could continue with real-time PCR and look at CRF, which is another gene that's involved in the stress response. And we could also look at D2, which is involved in the dopamine system. Thank you for your time. I welcome any questions if you have any. Yes?
I never realized that, I should have known, but you're handling drugs that are partly illegal. How difficult is it to work with such drugs?
How difficult is it to work with the drugs?
Yeah.
In terms of like getting our hands on them?
Yes.
So I don't really play a part in that side of things. I was more so provided the drug and was able to use it. We have a tracking system that tracks how much we're using. And so there is like pretty tight regulation on that.
Thank you.
Yes, you can relate.
Hi, Stevie. Great job. I was just wondering how you came, or what piqued your interest in this topic. Was there any, did you talk with Dr. Sachs beforehand, or is this something you brought to the table?
Yeah, so I did meet with Dr. Sachs beforehand. At the way started my project, I was actually interested in doing something with females, maybe with like the menstrual cycle. We were thinking of doing ovarectomies and seeing how that was going to impact the stress response. And then he passed over a couple papers to me, and that kind of introduced me to looking at stimulants. And so I started to look at amphetamine and seeing the gap and how females aren't really being included in that study, and seeing how females are affected by drug use and the stress susceptibility. And so I decided to kind of bring females into the study and look at sex differences as how I ended up doing that.
Can you explain like how you chose the stress paradigm and why you went with those specific tests?
Yes. So we decided to do a 3-day stress paradigm, and we chose this. It was adapted from a previous paper that was published in the Sachs lab. And so for the stressors, we did 1 day of conical tube restraint. And so essentially this just restricted the mouse's movement. For another day, we used fox urine and put that in a vial and put it in their cage. And so that was a way, it's a natural predator, and so that stressed them out for an hour. And then following that, on the final day, we did tail suspension, which is stressful. And so that was the paradigm that we chose.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, on behalf of Falvey and the Center for Research and Fellowship, I get to present you with your award.
Oh my gosh.
And here's your cord for commencement as well. So congratulations. Okay. Lose that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. It's a great way to start us off. So next up, I'd like to introduce the faculty mentor, Dr. Jennifer Santoro, for our next Falvey Scholar.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here on behalf of Dr. Stephen Strader, one of my colleagues in the Department of Geography and the Environment, who has been Sydney Walsh's primary academic advisor for her research. I've had the pleasure of having Sydney in a lot of my geographic information systems classes, but credit where credit is due, Dr. Strader has been her primary advisor. He just can't be here today. So I'm going to read a statement that Dr. Strader provided for me to introduce Sydney. Excuse me. Sydney is one of the most determined and hardworking students I've had the pleasure to work alongside. I've mentored her on several research projects over the last few years, witnessing her confidence and skills grow exponentially. Her research on tropical cyclone inland flooding and social vulnerability is a great example of her work ethic, her drive, and her desire to apply her skills to better understand a problem facing our world. Sydney completed her senior project in the fall of 2023, but approached me, Dr. Strader, in spring 2024 about continuing her tropical cyclone research, although there was no financial nor credit to be earned from continuing this work. She took the time out of her own busy schedule to build on her research so that it can be published. That was no small feat, considering Sydney is a double major in both geography and environmental science and works a part-time job. In all, I've never had to remind Sydney about due dates, ask her to complete analyses, finish her work, report her findings, etc. She takes the initiative and completes the work with a smile on her face, often being the first in the GIS lab at 7 a.m. As Dr. Strader and sometimes myself, as we walk by waving to her on our way to our offices to start our day, Sydney has already begun hers. And that's the thing about Sydney. Her day has already started. She's already and always been willing to pull herself out of bed when many won't, get her hands dirty, and work hard to achieve her goals. I am proud and beyond impressed with Sydney, and I will echo Dr. Strader's words right there for myself. I'm really excited for her future, and I can't think of any student, past or present, that deserves this honor more than her. Thank you.
So thanks to Dr. Santoro for reading that message from Dr. Strader, and I appreciate all of Dr. Santoro's help throughout my classes here at Villanova. So like Jen said, my project is my senior project from the fall, and it's about vulnerability to inland flooding from landfalling hurricanes in the US from 2016 to 2023. So what's a hurricane? It's a really violent storm with strong winds and strong rains that can cause many hazards to society. We could cause damaging winds, rip currents, inland flooding, storm surge, and tornadoes, to say a few. From 1963 to 2012, storm surge caused 50% of hurricane deaths in the US. However, since 2013, inland flooding caused 60% of deaths during hurricanes. And this switch in trends is what inspired me to do this study. Also, with climate change, intensity of hurricanes will increase and precipitation will increase by 20%. The size of hurricanes will also increase, so more people will be affected by hurricanes, and the speed of hurricanes will slow down, so once they reach land, they'll slow and drop more rain over people who live below them. The second part of my study was looking at the social vulnerability of people who live underneath these natural disasters. So what is social vulnerability? It's a measure of community resilience to external stressors, such as a hurricane. It considers social, economic, and demographic characteristics that impact people and their ability to recover from a disaster like a hurricane. The CDC created an index called the SVI to measure factors that influence people's social vulnerability. And on this index, they consider socioeconomic status, household characteristics, race, and housing type and transportation. They combine all of these scores in a scale from 0 to 1, and they assign these scores to counties across the country so that counties can be compared on their vulnerability to those external stressors. So my study wanted to look at the overlap of this hurricane risk and the social vulnerability risk. The 4 questions that I mainly asked in my study were, how much hurricane precipitation does the United States receive? Where is it happening the most often, and who lives in these areas? And what does this mean for inland flooding risk? To do this, I took a 3-step approach in my study. My study area was the United States, anywhere that experiences hurricane precipitation and experiences hurricanes that originate in the North Atlantic Ocean. And all of my analysis was done in ArcGIS Pro, a geographic information system used for mapping and displaying data. The first data set that I used for this study was called IB-Tracks. It contains hurricane information for hurricanes all the way back to the 1850s. It contains information on their wind speed, duration, and things of that nature. And I chose hurricanes based on 3 criteria. They had to occur after 2016, originate in the North Atlantic Ocean, and achieve hurricane strength within 600 kilometers of the United States. After I filtered the storms for these 3 criteria, I ended up with 28 storms, and these 28 hurricanes were used in my analysis. The next step of my methods was to get the rainfall totals for each of these storms, for each day of the storm, over its duration. And they were as satellite imagery, which I downloaded and uploaded into ArcGIS Pro. For this study, because I was thinking about inland flooding risk, I was only looking at hurricane precipitation 2 inches or greater, because 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period is thought to cause the most risk for inland flooding. So once I downloaded the data for all of the storms, I edited out all of the data that was below 2 inches and added them up in ArcGIS Pro. And after I did that for each of the 28 storms, I then added all of the 28 storms together to get one big image of all of the hurricane rain that's fallen since 2016. And then the last step of my methods was to get the hurricane precipitation at the county level so that we can compare it to social vulnerability data at the county level. And theoretically, you could click on a county anywhere in the United States and see how much rain it's gotten from hurricanes since 2016. And so here I just wanted to demonstrate what I mean when I say that I took each day of a storm and added them together. So I have an example of Hurricane Ida, which, as you might know, Philadelphia experienced a lot of inland flooding from Hurricane Ida, just from the large amounts of precipitation that it produced. So I'm just going to go day by day through this storm, and you could see on the map precipitation hotspots pop up across the country. So this is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then this is what the image would look like after I added all of those days together, and this is the total rainfall produced by Hurricane Ida at all the points it hit across the United States. And you can see that Philadelphia is under that dark purple cloud, so that's all rain greater than 2 inches. The results of my study showed that over 1,600 counties in the United States experienced some form of hurricane precipitation since 2016, and that's shown in the 2 maps of the U.S. on the right side of the screen. The first map is that original image of all of the hurricane precipitation, and the one below it is the hurricane precipitation at the county scale. The county that stuck out to have the most hurricane precipitation in recent history was Brunswick County in North Carolina. Across those 28 storms, it received almost 90 inches of rain just from hurricanes alone. So you could kind of get an idea of how much flooding North Carolina might have had since 2016. To further look at the areas that were getting the most amount of hurricane precipitation, I wanted to look at the counties that were in the top 10% of those rainfall totals. And what I found was that all of these counties are in the southern United States or the southeastern United States. So all of the counties in the red on the top of the map are those 170 counties in the top 10% of hurricane precipitation. And each of them received at least 4 inches of hurricane precipitation each year over the past 8 years. And within these 170 counties, over 30 million people would have been affected by that rainfall and could have experienced inland flooding. And the map on the bottom is that social vulnerability aspect of those counties. The blue colors show lesser social vulnerability, so they're scored lower on that CDC SVI index, so they might be more able to adapt to a hazard like inland flooding. And the counties shown in red are ones that score higher on that index. And a trend that popped out here was that the counties that score higher are removed from the coast, they're inland, so the flooding that they would receive would be inland flooding. And so the last piece of the puzzle was that social vulnerability score. And the main trend that showed up here was that as precipitation increases, vulnerability also increases. And this is true for most thresholds of hurricane precipitation. I looked at the top 25% and the top 10%, like I said, and for both of those thresholds, their vulnerability increases across all of the 4 big factors and most of the sub-factors that the CDC analyzes. So in the top 10%, people are about 22% more vulnerable in their socioeconomic status, 15% more vulnerable in their household characteristics, 25% more racially vulnerable, and 12% more vulnerable according to their housing type and transportation type. And overall, that score averages out to 23% more vulnerable on average for people in those top 10%. And just to reiterate where this trend is the strongest, I found that the southeastern United States was the most at risk, where they got a lot of hurricane precipitation and they're more vulnerable on a national scale. So there's a black outline around all of those 170 counties that were in the top 10%, and you can really see the difference between the red and the blue on these maps, where the red is the higher social vulnerability. And so I think that these rainfall estimates could be a really good indicator for inland flooding risk, especially for those inland counties, which my study and previous studies found tend to be more vulnerable than coastal counties. And again, the southeastern states at the same time contain the most vulnerable people and get the most hurricane precipitation, which puts them at risk for natural disasters caused by hurricanes. And this will continue to become important as with climate change, up to 127 more people will be exposed to inland flooding with population increase and the intensification of hurricanes. And just knowing where these people are and where this precipitation will happen, it'll help emergency managers better help these people adapt to this risk. And so this semester, I was able to add about 48 more storms to this database in addition to the original 28 that I began with. So it's a lot more data to take out the outliers, like the big hurricanes that everybody knows about, like Hurricane Ida, Harvey, Hurricane Michael, and to just get more data to support where these trends are happening the most. And I did this with the help of a fellow GEV senior, Tommy. He helped me out with downloading all of the data and incorporating this into my database. And so going forward, I hope to incorporate this precipitation into the social vulnerability trends that I saw with the first 28 storms. And so lastly, I just wanted to thank Dr. Santoro and Dr. Schrader for all their help on this project, teaching me GIS and supporting me throughout developing this idea. And thank you to Falvey for the award and having us here today to present our research. And then my family, who came all the way from Connecticut to hear the presentation.
Go ahead, you have one.
Nice job, Sydney. Thank you. I have a question about the. You said there's an increase, a shift in why people are dying from hurricanes to inland flooding, and so could you speak a little bit about why that shift is, and then sort of the second part of that question is the higher social vulnerability in places where there is more inland flooding. Is that just coincidence, or do you think it's a sort of a product of those areas being, more prone to flooding, and therefore, more vulnerable people will tend to be living there?
Yeah, so I think the big increase in the deaths from inland flooding have been because of land development and urbanization, and also just where people want to settle. The large majority of people live in city centers, so there's a lot of built environment in those areas, which increases the risk for flooding. So I think that's a big cause to why the trend shift. But also, it could be a difference in reporting deaths for storm surge versus inland flooding. So there could be a little discrepancy in the reporting aspect. And I do think that inland counties tend to be more vulnerable as opposed to coastal counties, just because of the cost that it brings to live in those coastal areas. And so it's often more attainable for people to live slightly removed from the coast, even if they want to be still near the coastline, because those coastal properties are so expensive.
Hi, great work. I got a question about necessarily what are some of the solutions that some of these inland counties may be able to propose, or do you have any, I don't know a ton about inland flooding necessarily. What are some of the ways in which they can kind of combat this type of issue and hopefully not be as affected?
Yeah, so like I said, just like allocating money towards people to manage disasters when they happen, but also there could be a lot of engineering adaptations that could be done in cities with a lot of built environment. Green stormwater infrastructure is something really important for cities when it comes to rain and flooding. In a city where there's none, all of the water just accumulates outside on the ground, which causes the flooding. But if there's more green space and green stormwater infrastructure to take that rain and put it somewhere else, I think it would reduce the risk. But with the new infrastructure, it comes with upkeep, and upkeep also costs money. So it's hand in hand, resources and putting those new infrastructures in place. Thank you for listening.
It is again my pleasure to present you with your Falvey Scholar Award and your cards for graduation and your gift cards on the way.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you, and John's going to come take our picture.
So is Sophie.
Okay. It's okay. Okay. Did you get what you needed? Okay. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
So our next faculty mentor is Dr. Meredith Mackenzie Greenlee.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here to introduce PJ. PJ has been working with me since January of 2023. And when PJ first approached me, his real interest was in sort of the pediatric nursing population, especially the impact of on nurses of sort of caring for patients at the end of life. And initially, when we were talking about sort of a study that he was going to apply for a birth for, we thought about a mixed method study, which I will say, for those of you who don't know, it's a very ambitious research design that includes both quantitative and qualitative methods. Not something we would typically suggest for an undergraduate to do. But PJ was very motivated and really had a good plan. And we went for it. So PJ was funded through the Villanova University Research Fellowship and also through the Davis Falvey Scholars Fund. He had a very busy summer where he was completing a full-time externship, but also was gathering data pretty much full-time. So gathered quantitative data from senior nursing, well, I'll let you tell him, I'll let him tell you all about it, but gathered data from a variety of nurses, then did qualitative interviews. He then proceeded to work with me to analyze that data. He has presented here at the university at both the undergraduate research day, at the nursing research day. He's also presented at regional nursing research conferences, as well as recently at an international nursing research conference. And his publication from this work has been submitted to a journal, and we are looking forward to publication in the next few months. So PJ has just been an enormously motivated, talented individual, has really, and as I've told him, honestly, the study that he has done would be something I'd be proud if a PhD student did. And so I am delighted that he's able to share his employment work with you.
Thank you everyone for coming. This is Caring Beyond Cure, so perspectives of pediatric oncology nurses on end of life. I would like to acknowledge the Davis family and the Villanova Undergraduate Research Fellowship for funding this, also the Falvey Library for providing all the excellent online resources, and I would like to thank the Flynn Foundation for recruitment. So, an introduction to pediatric oncology. Tens of thousands of pediatric patients are diagnosed with cancer every single year. Mortality rates have really decreased, but ultimately, approximately 1,600 pediatric oncology patients die every single year. And so if you're a pediatric oncology nurse, at some point in your career, you will be providing end-of-life care to a patient. So it's really crucial to understand how nurses come to gain experience in providing this care, how they feel comfortable with it, and really understanding their perspectives in this care. And again, this is crucial because nurses spend the most time with patients. To my nurses in the crowd, we know. And I would like to make a quick distinction between hospice and palliative care. Basically what this is saying is hospice care can only be administered not alongside curative treatment, so this is like more aimed at end-of-life care, so this is the last 6 months of life. Whereas palliative care can be implemented at any point in someone's journey through cancer, and it's really focused on symptom management. So nurses face many barriers to providing end-of-life care, but I think it's important to recognize really the two here that I'm going to discuss, which is comfortability with providing the medical and the nursing care, and your comfort in providing like family and psychosocial care, working with kids, families, the whole care team. I think it's also important to acknowledge that in pediatric oncology, there's really no such thing as just the patient. We're really taking care of parents, working with siblings. As someone who's had experience in pediatric oncology, almost all the time, the whole family's there supporting the patient. So the objectives of our study were to describe the attitudes and comfort with providing palliative and end-of-life care among three groups, and that being senior nursing students, novice nurses, and experienced nurses. And we wanted to examine the relationship between experience, burnout, and how these correlate with attitudes and comfort with providing end-of-life care. So our methods. So our sample were, again, senior nursing students, novice nurses, and experienced nurses, and these all came from large academic pediatric hospitals in the Northeast. The senior nursing students came from the Flint Foundation. So this is a program where juniors in the summer between their junior and senior year, they're completing a externship in pediatric oncology, and the novice nurses were nurses with 0 to 2 years, whereas experienced nurses were those with 2 years plus. So to talk about our data collection, we started with a demographic survey, and then we modified this tool called the FATCOD, which is used to measure attitudes toward providing end-of-life care. This is typically used in adults, but we modified it to be more pediatric-centric. We also used the ProQual subscale. This was used to measure burnout among nurses. And then we completed semi-structured interviews with 10 of the participants. So again, this is going into our quantitative data and our qualitative data, quantitative being from the survey, and the qualitative being the interviews that were transcribed. And so for our results, demographically speaking, the average participant was a white female in her 20s who had her BSN. And we can see that, obviously the students were in their early 20s, novice nurses about 25, and experienced nurses 29. And I would also like to note that for experienced nurses only being 29 is sort of alarming for those interested in nurse burnout and really nurse turnover that has been happening in the past couple of years. So the quantitative results, there are a lot of numbers on the screen, but what's important here is in the top right, we have age being correlated with more poor attitudes toward providing end-of-life care, education and experience being correlated with more positive attitudes toward providing end-of-life care, and burnout being correlated with more negative attitudes toward providing end-of-life care. And so really the big question from our survey was, did your undergraduate education include content on caring for the dying child and their family? And it's important to note that only two out of a total of 37 nurses surveyed answered yes, it prepared me to provide end-of-life care. So this is really alarming, as this was only about 5%, 12.5%. And for our qualitative themes that emerged, so these are the themes that emerged from the interviews, and this is really what I'm going to use most of my time talking about, because I think this is what's most accessible and sort of easier to understand for those not familiar with the healthcare setting. So these were role of the nurse, challenges of preparedness and training, and parent and team barriers. So although they are separate, it's important to note that they all sort of interact with each other, right? And sort of what we can think of in the middle here is the lived experience in providing end-of-life care. There are also many sub-themes that emerge from each of these, but we will go into that. So the first quote I have for you is, the nurse really needs to be paying attention and advocating for the patient. And that might mean risking a difficult conversation with a parent or making someone a little upset. You're aiming not to do those things, but the patient is the most important thing, and so you have to advocate for them all the time. So this is an excellent example of how nurses sort of exude patient advocacy, and sort of the secondary theme here is parent barriers. So, truly parents are experiencing their worst nightmare. Their child has been diagnosed with cancer, and it's very difficult to sort of have these conversations with families. And we're not aiming to make parents upset, but at the end of the day, you do have to advocate for your patient. Whether that be pain management or maybe getting a palliative care team involved. Our second quote is, giving them, the family, the knowledge of what to look for is so important that when the time comes, it's not, oh my God, I'm panicked, my child's dying. It's, oh, I know what's going to happen. My nurse walked me through this, and I understand what's going to happen when my child starts to die. So, really we see the nurse as the educator emerging here. Although this is very difficult, it's still crucial for nurses to explain to parents and families the dying process and sort of what's going to come in the next, say, months, weeks, hours, depending on the timeline. Pretty much December to February was a very, very low time in my life at the hospital. I really questioned whether I wanted to work here. I took care of 3 separate patients. I flipped them all, meaning I flipped them to hospice. I was the nurse who was with them, individually had the conversations with the families, made them hospice. Then for 2 out of 3 of them, I was with them when they either went to the ICU or they died. So here we can really see the emotional impact of being a pediatric oncology nurse. I think this quote is a great example of how in a span of only 2 to 3 months, you can see the unimaginable. And this really takes a toll on nurses throughout the field, and there is such a high turnover rate from burnout. We had a kid who was 13, 14. The parent didn't even want him to know he had cancer. Meanwhile, he was actively on hospice. It was like tiptoeing around what we're doing. Then over time, the kid was like, why am I getting this medicine? Why is this happening? We were like, oh, great question. Let's bring in your parents. Let's have your parents answer it. So there are some parents who do choose not to tell their child that they do have cancer. This is allowed, because the parent is the decision maker. They ultimately have the choice. And this can present barriers, especially when kids are 13 or 14. It's a bit easier when kids are younger, but this makes it extremely difficult for parents to work with this age group, because when kids are asking questions and say the parent's not there or the parent's asleep, or it's just difficult when you have to always turn to parents to be your beacon of knowledge. So, and then it kind of brings in questions of consistency between tens or maybe 100 nurses who need to coordinate all this care. They, being the medical team, always add fuel so the parent has something to hold on to. They never allow, I don't want to say the crushing, the reality of it, but I feel like there's a lot of times where parents are like, oh no, we're going to get on this trial. I think it'll work this time. So this is more in regards to palliative care, that being symptom management, where a lot of parents may hear the word palliative and automatically think hospice. So they associate palliative care with end of life, whereas this isn't true. But really also what's emerging here is, in large academic medical centers, pediatric patients are often on 5, 6, 7, 10 research trials. There are many, many trials for experimental drugs, and there's always something new for a medical team to present to patients and families. And so what happens here is what some may call providing false hope leads to barriers to really getting pain management and, say, getting a palliative care team involved. So here we see team barriers leading to parent barriers where they might not want so for challenges of preparedness of training, I would say the only thing that's prepared me is the in-person experience and the more you do it. It's more learning on the job and learning from experienced nurses who have been through it before and how to best support patients and families. So here we say that there's no really preparation you can do. If you're a new nurse, you're just going to walk in the door, probably just have to do it for the first time and learn as you go. Or learning from more experienced nurses who can sort of help guide you, but as I said earlier, experienced nurses are few and far between. The sub-theme here is the Flynn Fellowship. The lunch and learns have definitely been essential in helping me understand, or in helping me to learn how to provide palliative care. So again, the Flynn Fellowship is a program for junior students entering their senior year, and throughout the summer, Flynn Fellows have the opportunity to attend lunch and learns. So this is on a variety of topics, radiation, bone marrow transplant, but this also includes palliative care. So this is great for any incoming pediatric oncology nurses as they get a real chance to learn how to provide this care and learn about pediatric oncology. So I thought it'd be useful to look at the Flynn Fellowship and examine some student experiences. I was horrified, terrified, all the above. I was really nervous. I was scared. I was very apprehensive of going in the room. I had a moment where I was like, self, this is not okay. You need to provide care in the same way that you would to any other patient. In nursing school, you learn a lot about communication and reading the room and how to manage the room. For me, I just didn't know how to even walk in the room and interact with people. So here we see students from even an undergraduate prepared student nurse is having difficulty, and really understandable difficulty, but this is something that we can address in undergraduate nursing education. I think having the privilege to work with dying children has completely solidified for me that this is what I'm meant to be doing. I'm meant to be in pediatric oncology, and the special patients that I hold within my heart, I take them to work with me every day and really use them to motivate me. So I included this quote because this is very tough subject matter, but I think it's important to remember that a lot of these nurses really do feel a vocation and a calling to do this work. And this is an example of a student nurse who does hear this calling and is ready to be in pediatric oncology and everything that entails. And for my implications for further research would be to explore the parent and team barriers that were mentioned earlier. This is something that hasn't really emerged in the literature before. And secondly, it's crucial that we address this gap in knowledge in undergraduate education in providing end-of-life care, not only to pediatric patients, but really as a whole. Because if you are a nurse, no matter in what setting you're working at, there is still a decent chance that you will provide end-of-life care. So it's really important that we address this education. Lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Meredith Mackenzie Greenlee, as this project would not have been possible without her, and I appreciate everything that she's done for me. I believe we have time for questions.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really nothing new that nurses experience burnout from the sheer amount of patients that they have to care for, but also then they face palliative care. Do hospitals support healthcare workers in any way with the emotional burden?
Yeah, so recently there's this idea of like hospitals promoting like nurse resiliency, which is kind of just saying like suck it up and do it, which is really not helpful. Maybe large, I know a few large medical centers do have, say, like an in-staff psychologist. This is also something that may be covered by your healthcare plan to see a therapist. So some large medical centers do have resources to like attend therapy.
I don't know if this came up in your research process, but pediatric oncology sounds like one of the worst, emotionally draining options in the hospital. And did you encounter if that was true in your analysis about the burnout and all those other things, or is it relatively this similar across different nursing specialities?
I think in the day-to-day, I appreciate everybody's attention. This is a very difficult topic. I think day-to-day nursing care is very similar to maybe different settings. I think the only difference is that the lows are very low and the highs are very high. I can think of patients who I worked with this summer who have since passed away. But I also have memories of kids who have been discharged, playing Uno with them, just hanging out with the kids. It's very special. Most of the time, you do enjoy it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to let our picture take your combo. Your cord, and then so thank you very much. Great set of topics so far. It's just amazing. So next on our list is I would like to welcome our faculty mentor, Dr. Lance Kenny.
Spending so much time together, she didn't even want to sit with me. It's a pleasure to be here. It is a genuine joy to be able to introduce Katie Jordan, who, despite the fact, had me as a student, as a freshman, still stuck with political science. In trying to explain to friends and colleagues, especially people my age and older, Katie's tired of hearing this, the best metaphor I've been going with is the phenomenon of the blood diamonds. Remember that had public attention and public consciousness about a decade ago. Movies, exposés by academic journals, in-depth reporting by newspapers. Katie's project is similar in that she is looking at the impact that gold and gold excavation and mining has on the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa. She's looking at issues of non-state actors, in some cases terrorism, in unstable states. Given that there have been 8 military coups in this region in the past 4 years, this is very relevant. And I think, like our previous presenter, I think the thing that impresses me the most is she's walking that very fine line between qualitative data and quantitative data, and is being remarkably interdisciplinary in her approach to the topic, to the point where if we have the opportunity in years to come to hear another scholar talking about this subject, I'm convinced that Katie's going to be the bulk of the literature review. So please join me in welcoming Katie Jordan.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here today. I'll just get my slides up really quick. So my name is Katie Jordan. I'm a senior poli-sci and economics major, and I just want to start out by thanking Professor Lance Kenny and then my two econ professors, Dr. Imao and Dr. Menzendick. Without their help and support, I definitely would not be able to be giving the presentation that I am today. So I'm going to be talking about the state of the mine and how artisanal gold mining in the Sahel creates and facilitates conflict in the region. So to start off, before I begin by defining ASGM, or artisanal gold mining, I want to give a brief contextualization of the Sahel. The Sahel is a geographic region that is located on the southern border of the Saharan Desert. And so it's a space that's definitely conditioned a lot by environmental characteristics, expanding desertification, a lot of scarcity in resources, but very strong in terms of natural resources and minerals. It's also a region, like Professor Kenny said, that is very politically unstable in many ways. In the past 2 years, between 2020 and 2022, there were 6 coups in the region, 2 of which were in Burkina Faso. Overwhelmingly, there's a very large population of displaced people. In the region, over 2.3 million people have been displaced, both internally and across state borders. And around 1.6 million of those are in Burkina Faso, which is a new epicenter for a lot of the violence that is seen in the region. With that being said, I do also want to disclaim that conflict is not the only way in which we should be understanding the Sahel and the entire continent of Africa and the entire developing world. There's a lot of richness, both in terms of economics, politics. There's cities, and so understanding this strictly through a conflictual view is something that is very limited, and I want to disclaim that before jumping into what I'm looking at, which is how minerals, specifically gold, affect conflict in outlying regions. So artisanal and small-scale gold mining is characterized by intense labor activity that's located often in very remote regions of the Sahel and very isolated sites far from centers of political and economic power. It's characterized by the use of rudimentary techniques and low levels of technologization. And so this distinguishes it from large-scale gold mining, which is much more mechanized and much more broad in terms of geographic scope. It's also characterized by very exclusionary dynamics, elite capture, and there's a lot of state predation and non-state predation as well in and around these gold mines. So around 20% of global gold production is sourced from artisanal gold mining. And this is something that, we see gold in technologies, we see it in Tiffany and things that we wear. We also see it in central banks. It's a very prevalent sector in terms of both just money securitization, also money laundering. So gold has a huge impact in a lot of areas of the economy that we don't necessarily expect it to. In 2019, around $38 billion to the overall gold economy was created by artisanal gold mining, and worldwide, as of 2012, which was the most recent estimate that I was able to find, there were an estimated 20 million people involved in gold mining. Many of the people who are involved in gold mining are pushed there either because of expanding desertification, they're being pushed off of agricultural or pastoral plots of land and ways of life, and they're pushed into more extractive mineral and mining careers. And a lot of people also find themselves in these sectors, not necessarily through their own choice, but rather through human smuggling and trafficking that is conditional on them working in a gold mine for a particular period of time. There's also a lot of environmental dangers associated with the low levels of mechanization in artisanal gold mining. It's the largest anthropogenic source of mercury emissions, and these mercury emissions and contact with mercury can have extremely detrimental effects on individuals' neurological well-being. And this is something that when you're working with gold and you're touching it with your hands in the way that artisanal gold miners are, they're literally pulling gold out from the earth, mixing it with mercury compounds, squeezing it out with cloth in order to kind of separate the mercury and the gold and then refine it. That is something that is incredibly dangerous. And so from an overall formalization perspective, formalizing the artisanal gold mining sector and regulating that, if possible, would be a way to avoid those environmental and health-based levels of insecurity. But there's also a more political aspect to the insecurity surrounding gold mines as well. So as I said, social and security-related vulnerabilities that can be associated with gold mining includes poverty traps, employer predation, vulnerability to trafficking and smuggling. And then there's two aspects of the state's role in artisanal gold mining that I was particularly interested in my research project, and that is state negligence, whether or not a state is caring about the people who are in these gold mines and caring either about their health or about all of these other vulnerabilities that they're subject to, or active state violence, because gold mines are often cited as by states as hotbeds for insurrection, extremism, and that's not necessarily the case, but it is often an excuse that's used by states to legitimate force that they might use against people who work at gold mines. So these are some maps that I wanted to throw up of the Sahel region that I'm looking at. So on the left, topmost map, you can see the hotbeds and hotspots for illicit gold mining activities and crime that's associated with gold mining. On the left, there's that same map that's superimposed with a series of political violence and armed violence events that occur in red. And then on the bottom here, that's a map of Burkina Faso, and it's showing in gold the known gold mines that exist there and how over the course of 3 different years, different militant and armed attacks occurred, increasingly encroaching on gold mines. And so there's definitely a very high association between conflict and mineral deposits like you can see here. And I was wondering in my research question, why is that? And what is it that's necessarily driving this association? So in order to understand conflict and understand how resources and conflict interact, there's a few different dimensions that we can use. So the first is understanding dimensions of rebel and non-state capacity. And these are often defined in the literature as the power to target and the power to resist, which distinguish themselves on the sense that rebel groups who have the power to target have sufficient capacity to achieve military victories against other actors, including the state. And their involvement with resource trade will fuel their own military capacity. And then that is then correlated with shorter conflicts, as states are more likely to offer concessions to rebel groups that they know are strong enough to inflict actual harm that the state will feel. By contrast, the power to resist suggests a state in which rebel groups are not able to defeat the state, but they can avoid state repression. And so military capacity is not enough to impose sufficient costs on the state to avoid longer conflicts. However, there's a degree of flexibility that non-state actors have that would allow them to kind of evade being completely repressed, and this in turn leads to longer conflicts that are very mobile and transient. And it's very, this is a very apt characterization of a lot of the conflict that we're seeing currently in Sahel. So there's also dimensions of resource analysis and understanding what is it about particular resources that makes them profitable or usable to non-state groups. And these are lootability and obstructability. So lootability asks the question of how easy can a non-state actor extract resources themselves. And so in the case of gold mines, this would be a case if a particular non-state group has claimed control over a gold mine and was able to facilitate gold extraction by their own means or through appropriating the labor of others. Because of the fact that artisanal gold mining has such low levels of, or low costs of entry, it's far easier for non-state actors to kind of enter into this space of taking up gold and looting it. Whereas obstructability asks the question of how easy it is for non-state actors to obtain resources after they've already been extracted from the ground. And so this can refer to seizing gold while it's in transit, obstructing the state's flow of revenue, and this is something that is inherently oppositional in addition, rather than strictly taking the profits of gold for oneself. You're both taking the profits of gold and you're stopping someone else from having access to them. So the method by which extraction occurs intrinsically ties into this as well. so we can understand different dimensions of rebel resource extraction as extorting gold versus smuggling it. One is very localized, and the localization of gold mines that enables extortion is something that means that conflict intensity in that particular region will be far more concentrated and far more just visible at a geographic point. And by contrast, smuggling is something that occurs in transit, and tying these back into our previous characterizations of rebel power, we can understand extortion as something that limits rebel mobility, and therefore means that your capacity to resist the state is a little bit lower because you're an easier target if you're sitting up. You can't really move gold mines around. They are where the gold deposits are. Whereas smuggling is something that intrinsically ties into criminal networks, road systems, other methods of smuggling. So different markets that cross borders, that cross different regions, that have nodes both in cities and in outlying regions. These are all things that play into smuggling networks, and that in fact facilitates a rebel group's capacity to resist the state. And it also ties illicit activity into an informal economy that exists separate from illicit activity, but can be repurposed in facilitating conflict. So specifically at gold, gold is both a lootable and an obstructable resource. There's incredibly low barriers to ASGM sectors and mining, like I said before, meaning that the localized nature of gold mines leads to higher use of extortion tactics, while at the same time gold is obstructable, particularly when it's being transported over land because it has a very high value to rate ratio. And so it's easily hijacked by non-state actor groups, and at the same time permits some form of flexibility for them. And alongside that, gold and the illicit gold market is a major market alongside arms trafficking, particularly in Sahel, showing how the militarization of gold markets and weaponization of conflicts in the region that are driven by profit-seeking motives around gold mines are tied together. So the proximity to state power and the role of the state in these is also incredibly important. We're not existing in a vacuum necessarily here. And the response of state actors to the presence of gold mines and to non-state actors' use of gold mines does have a really big impact on how conflict unwinds in the region. So we can look at two different cases. The Sahel, which I understand that this entire region is the Sahel, but in this case we're referring specifically to that area of southern Mali, northwestern Guinea, and then pretty much the entirety of Burkina Faso in this case. And then the Tibesti region, which is up in the northern mountainous region of Niger and Chad. And so in these two cases, we see two separate state responses to the prevalence of artisanal gold mining. State patronage was something that occurred and was more visible in the Sahel region, in which there's a lot of proximity between state actors and artisanal non-state mining and armed actors. And so the states tended to build a sort of relational patronage network between mine sites and the state itself, whereas in the Tibesti region, the governments adopted a very repressive stance to the presence of a lot of gold mines, cracked down on them often militantly because of their citing those gold mines as sites of terrorist and criminal organization. And the closures of those gold mines that were employing a lot of people led to very violent escalations that is somewhat legitimate in the sense that if you're a person who has no other avenue of work or of economic survival, the closure of a gold mine, which is your only source of that, would be something that you would fight for. So from these two cases, we can kind of see how whether or not a state forms a patronage network with a gold mine and with non-state armed groups enables state co-optation of mining profits and simultaneously a more peaceable relation between the two, or a more transactional relation in a sense. So non-state actors would retain de facto control over those gold mines while the state would be able to seek rents from it at the same time. In this case, there's a pro and a con. More peace is definitely the pro, but the con would be that there's definitely a degree of less separation between state and non-state actors, meaning that the state becomes more entrenched in criminal markets, and over time that can definitely erode rule of law and just general care for the well-being of citizens. In the other case in which the state fails to build patronage networks and shuts down or seizes mines, the state regulatory power over ASGM is reduced, minors are displaced, popular discontent is implemented, and overall that would exacerbate instability and conflict while also heightening state repression. So I wanted to take a more empirical analysis approach to this. So I used the work of Bazzi and Blattman as well as Behrman et al. From 2017 to kind of understand how specifically gold magnifies conflict risk with all of these kind of contextual pieces in mind. So Bazzi and Blattman cite 7 different ways in which, or channels through which gold can exacerbate conflict. And the 2 that they particularly look at are rebellion, feasibility, and greed and rent seeking. So rebellion feasibility refers to the fact that the profits from a particular resource will make it easier for a non-state actor to fund conflict and whereas greed and rent seeking means that the localization of gold mines and the demand associated with gold mines means that conflict around those gold mines will be more likely and more intense because conflict will occur there because that's where profits can be gained. Other sources of, or channels through which the presence of minerals impacts conflict is through weak state capacity and institutional extractivity, which can be understood as kind of like typical resource curse sort of theory. The capital intensivity and local grievances that were cited by Bazzi and Blattman I actually found to not really apply to the ASGM context. I'd be more than happy to go into that in question time, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over that for now. And then they also cited migration and demographic change as influxes of laborers could change local politics and incite some form of popular discontent. So the data that I used in order to kind of get more at how these 2 first channels affected conflict in the Sahel, I looked at data from the RMD, Interior RMG data set, which included data on mines and minerals and from all across the entire African continent. And then I broke down that data set to look specifically at gold in Sahel. And I merged that data set with data on conflict events from ACLED. So my unit of analysis was cell year units at the 55-kilometer level at the equator. And I used these geospatial cells in order to alleviate any concerns of endogeneity when looking at conflict in a particular region. So overall, I had 69,550 cell year units that I was analyzing in my panel data set. And these included 4,964 individual cells across a 14-year period. Definitely, there were a lot of limitations with the data because, as you might expect, the informality associated with ASGM means that not a lot of record keeping goes on. They're also operating largely outside of the scope of governments who might want to look at them, and they're doing so purposefully as well because you're trying to avoid government crackdowns. So with that in mind, a lot of the mines that were included in my data were large-scale mines as opposed to small-scale mines. And definitely there was the question of whether or not there would be different dynamics associated with those because the perhaps large-scale mines are run with a degree more of legitimacy that can be verified in the global market, whereas artisanal gold mines can be far more informal, far more violently run, and aren't really subject to the same level of oversight. So the raw materials data set included information on the location, the opening year, the level of activity, the minerals produced, and mine ownership structures. And it was a global scope that spanned from 1997 all the way up to 2010. Whereas my ACLED data included geospatial data on all recorded conflict that occurred in the region that was compiled both from individual news sources, government reports, accounts from humanitarian responders, and NGOs. And these included the types of conflict events that were occurring, event outcomes, actors, mentalities, etc. So for my empirical strategy, I know that there's a bit of math on this page, but I decided to use an instrumental variable regression method in which I was looking at how the change in the value of a particular mine would affect conflict. So rather than looking at the presence of gold mines, I looked at the value of that, and I calculated the value by multiplying the presence of gold mines, which was a binary variable, times whatever it was that was the global gold price for that particular year. So between 1997 and 2010, the price of gold increased from $338 for 1 ounce of gold all the way up to $1,804. That's a really huge difference. And so what you expect to see in that period of time would be, perhaps if my hypothesis holds, a similar increase in conflict that can be attributed specifically to these mineral prices. My conflicts, I decided to measure at both extensive margin and intensive margin. So I looked first at, does the value, an increase in the value of a gold mine mean that conflict will occur versus not occur? Then I looked at how much conflict would occur given 1% increase in the value of a gold mine, and then what type of conflict was occurring in those regions. And I included fixed effects for each individual geospatial cell, the year, and the country in which the cell was, as well as environmental, social, governance, and proximity controls. So at my extensive margin, you can see in this first table that I found some statistically significant results insofar as the 1% increase in the price of gold mine, or value of the gold mine, did increase conflict by around 0.5%, or by a probability of 0.05, in places where there already was at least one conflict occurring. Then for my instrumental variable look at intensive margins, you can see that there's a significant increase in how an increase in the percentage value of a gold mine affects conflict, both for our total sample population, but also for only cells with gold mines, cells that neighbor gold mines, both of those combined, and then cells where there was conflict as well. A really interesting thing that I found, though, was that there's not really as much significance for the number of conflicts that are occurring in a particular cellular where there is already gold, but there is a statistically significant effect for the number of conflicts increasing around gold mines. And so that kind of led me to question whether or not is conflict occurring strictly where there are gold mines because that conflict is becoming more intensive, or is it that conflict is being displaced by increases in mining value? And so in order to understand this a little bit more, I wanted to look also at the fact that really only violence against civilians, armed conflict, and conflict being perpetrated by armed actors would increase with each given increase in the price of gold, as opposed to conflict generally that would be more civilian-led, such as protests and riots. And so I expected to see a statistically significant increase in violence against civilians and battle events, but no statistically significant change for riots and protests, which was actually the opposite of what I saw in this data, and that was something that was definitely very surprising that I'm hoping to kind of build a narrative around and look into more in coming years. I also did a spatial analysis, and I did not find any statistically significant results for either my binary measures of conflict or for the disaggregated types of conflict. But looking at the overall amount of conflict events that occurred, there was a statistically significant result, once again, only for conflicts that were around gold mines, but not in gold mines or gold mining cells. And so I think that that was really one of the main interesting points from this data that I wanted to look into more. And so for my key takeaways, I found, firstly, there are some definite limitations in the data that I was using, and greater data collection would be something that would absolutely benefit any future analysis about this. Secondly, my results did affirm the greed and rent-seeking hypotheses that were supported by Buzz and Blattman as well, but there are future questions about what about the other channels of mineral resources affecting conflict, and kind of looking into those at a deeper level that I will hope to do in the future as well. The spatial diffusion of conflict to neighboring cells was the major takeaway from the data that I saw. And so Behrman, who also conducted a very similar analysis, found in addition to conflict being spatially diffused, like from one particular mine site to neighboring regions, that there was a radiation of conflict events based off of who it was that was fighting around a particular gold mine, if they won mine that gold mine, then there was a radiation of conflict to other areas where that same group was fighting, even if it was in a completely different geographic area. That wasn't something that I was able to replicate with the data that I had, but it's definitely interesting understanding how one particular conflict is not something that is discrete, it's something that affects and unites the entire area in general. And then finally, gold's obstructability rather than lootability as a conflict vector was definitely a major theme that I saw in the data. Understanding perhaps the fact that maybe the reason why conflict was not occurring in the particular cells where there were gold mines, but rather in the surrounding 55-kilometer cells, could be because non-state actors were trying to obstruct gold flows once they had already left the immediate mining vicinity. And so that was a major theme that I think tied back to some of the other relationships, since that obstructability and act of collecting and smuggling gold while in transit would be something that would simultaneously also have a political rather than purely economic impact, insofar as in obstructing gold, you're also building your own power to resist repression, thereby exacerbating conflict, but also increasing its longevity. And so this slide basically discusses that in a little bit more depth. There's definitely some other rationales that could be taken as to why conflict we're seeing an increase in strictly outside of gold mining cells, but not in them. Perhaps it's because larger scale mines are more incentivized to secure the mines that they own because they are aware of the risks that are associated with potential smuggling and obstruction. But overall, I think that the fact that conflict was diffused in that spatial way kind of shows how power is kinetic, and that the non-state actors conducting conflictual relations and showing their power indicates how power in the region is not just mobile, but it also involves controlling the mobility of others as they move. So thank you once again for all of you for being here. Thank you for everything, and thank you, Dr.
So I'm going to ask if we can postpone questions until the very end for everyone if you have remaining questions. First, come. Thank you. Thank you. Stop for 1 moment so you can get your I know. Sorry. Oh my gosh. Sean's working on it. Okay. Come on back. Thank you. Congratulations. Okay.
Whoop, no.
Thank you.
You should go back to one more side.
Oh.
It's the red in the back.
Sorry. This way. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
All right, so next, I'd like to invite Dr. Aaron Wim Hoff up.
Thank you, and I am very, very happy to be here to introduce Matt Cullen, who is a graduating senior here in mechanical engineering. I first met Matt back during his sophomore year. He reached out to me just out of the blue saying he's interested in doing research. He's quite independent. I'm sure that's the quality of all of the Falvey Scholars. They're all very independent, self-driven, very motivated. So Matt reached out to me, and he ended up working with my PhD student at the time, named KATHLEEN, on his experimental test rig that was in SEER. And he worked with them, just kind of helping out and learning on the job, if you will. But then later on, we had an opportunity for him to get a little bit more involved in an independent project. An independent project was funded through a research experience for undergraduate supplement through the National Science Foundation. And that summer, Matt met with me, and he started looking into issues related to the potential for renewable energy being located on site next to data centers. So for those of you not familiar with data centers, they're basically large facilities with lots of computers. You access them all the time whenever you do anything related to cloud computing or data storage, online banking, web searches, that kind of stuff. So what Matt did is he poured through a lot of data. He used a library to do a lot of literature review. And in the end, what he did is he found the exact locations in the US where you get the best bang for your buck in terms of putting renewable energy near a data center. in the sense of minimizing or having the biggest reduction rather in your carbon footprint or your water scarcity footprint. So that's what Matt's going to do. So that work was we presented it at a conference last summer. We were invited because the work was so good. We got invited to update it and submit it to a journal, which we did, which is now published. And then going back to the very beginning, that work he did with Rehan, that is an additional journal paper rather, which we're going to submit next week. So all that stuff is coming to fruition now. There's even a third publication he's on that we're working together on, which we'll be putting out probably in the next few months or so. So very, very productive. One of the most productive undergrads I've ever had the pleasure of doing research with. With that, I will say that Matt is going to be going off to the University of Michigan in their graduate program, and they're very lucky to have him. So with that, I'll introduce Matt. Please come on up.
Absolutely.
All right. Can you guys hear me? All right. Can you guys hear me? Awesome. Okay. So as Dr. Villanova said, my name is Matt McMullen. I'm here presenting my research that was in a publication that was just published last month on a paper titled Data Center Environmental Burden Reduction Through On-Site Renewable Power Generation. So firstly, I'll recap again what exactly is a data center, because I know it's a pretty vague term for some people. Essentially, again, what it is, it's a building that houses a lot of computers. Whenever you access the internet, whenever you save data on a cloud storage computer, that's basically what you're accessing. And one of these things that's really important about these data centers is they consume a lot of electricity. It's close to 1% of all global electricity is consumed just in data centers, and this number is only rising. It's roughly about 500 terawatts. If that sounds like a really big number, it's because it is. And one of the things that come about with producing so much electricity is we heard a lot about climate change, is all the power it creates. You get a lot of carbon emissions. It uses a lot of the valuable resources we need on this earth. So it's really important for, data centers to become more environmentally friendly. And one of the most proposed solutions has been utilizing on-site renewable energies. Basically, what this means is putting renewable energies next to a data center and drawing direct power from those specific sources. So what my study kind of investigates is how beneficial is this? I think we've all heard about it, and everyone probably assumes it's good, but actually statistical analysis on how beneficial it is. And then also depending on the locational variance. So one of the things that's not talked about a lot with renewable energy resources is that their carbon footprint, their carbon emissions, their water consumption that's involved with producing electricity is very variable by location. So looking at not only the carbon footprint and water scarcity for each power generation technology, but also on a locational standpoint. And then what I'm going to do is tie that directly to data centers. They have a unique way of consuming power. So understanding how they consume power in relation to renewable energy and converting that into kind of maps where we can predict where is the best bang for your buck, where we can see the best improvement when it comes to water and carbon footprint. So first, talk a little bit about the methods and how I went about this. So first involves compiling a lot of information from a lot of databases. This was from the EIA, the EPA, the Falvey library, using a lot of the online journals and reading publications, getting to kind of know the topic area. Next, I determined some factors. One of them is called the EWIF, which stands for the Energy Water Intensity Factor. Second is the Carbon Emission Factor. I'm going to get a little bit later in my presentation about exactly what each one of those means. And then understanding what these values are, I was able to calculate them for all counties on a, so my locational standpoints in terms of counties in the United States. And I'm able to calculate these for the already currently existing energy generation technologies in each county in the United States. And then I'm able to replace those with new on-site renewables for data centers and see the improvement in the carbon footprint and the water footprint. So my metrics. So I know there's a lot of calculations up here and a lot of words. Very briefly, things that you should see on this slide when I talk is the two main metrics I'm looking at, which are called carbon usage effectiveness and water scarcity usage effectiveness. So carbon usage effectiveness is basically how efficiently can you get your electricity produced and not produce a ton of carbon. So it's on a per unit basis. So what you're looking out of this metric is you're looking to get a very low number. You're looking to see you produce a lot of electricity, but you don't consume a lot of carbon when you do so. And then the same thing with water, but the difference with water that's important is we add the scarcity metric. So a lot of times when I explain this to people, I say that, when we talk about places like Nevada and Arizona, a gallon of water there is a lot more important to them than it is here. So it's really important to kind of understand that the scarcity of the water in certain places is more important than others. So adding that factor in these calculations is going to be really important. I'm going to get into a little bit for this next few slides about some of these metrics I'm looking at here. Some of them are generalized, but I know some of them are a little bit confusing, so I'm going to talk about those for a second. So first, EWIF. So this stands again for Energy Water Intensity Factor. And what this does is it quantifies the amount of water that is consumed in producing electricity dependent on the energy generation technology. So you might ask, how do you consume water when you produce electricity? Well, here's an example. When you have a hydro dam, you have to dam up the water behind. Eventually, a lot of that water is going to evaporate through ambient conditions, and that in turn is consuming water in order to produce electricity. When you have to manufacture a solar panel, you have to utilize water in the manufacturing process. When you get rid of it, you have to utilize water. So that's where we're understanding how much water you're consuming per energy generation technology, dependent on the location. So again, each one of these counties shows the current energy generation technologies there, and depending on the type of technology and the locational standpoint, we're able to understand exactly where they consume a lot of water when they produce electricity currently. The next metric I'm going to look at is what's called Aware CF, and this is actually from a previous study that I took that was incorporating my calculations. This generally just tells how scarce is water in the United States currently. This is very general. It's a range from 0.1 to 100. 0.1 means there's a lot of water. You can leave your faucets on for as long as you want. And 100 means that there's not a lot of water left. So what this calculation takes into account is there's a certain amount of water, and then there's an environmental need, right? So plants, crops, things that require water that are part of the environment. If you're at 100, we are consuming, the human consumption is higher than what is even available. So what that basically means is that the environmental needs are not even being met in these locations. So it's very important that we're very conscientious about these locations and what energy generation technologies we utilize. Next, CEF. So I talked a little bit about the water side of things. I'm going to come back to the carbon side. This is the same thing as the EWF, but think of it in terms of carbon. So we're looking to see how much carbon is produced on a per unit basis per energy generation technology. And again, we're looking at on the county-wide scale. As you can see, it's pretty scattered. In general, you see places where there's a lot of coal mining, petroleum, natural gas production, which is generally kind of in the middle of the United States. You can see those having higher values. So what we're looking is to reduce the CEF of the county and the production that you're intaking so that you can therefore decrease the amount of carbon that's produced. Let's talk about some results. In terms of water, what I've done here is I've looked at what if you took 25% of a data center's needs and you met it with on-site renewable generation. So what this graph here on the left shows is that if you were to replace it with, let's say, a wind farm that met 25% of the needs, you would improve pretty much everywhere. In some places, you see higher improvements. So in places like Arizona, California, more arid climates, you see improvements that are really, really high. Again, when we move to solar, the reason why is solar is a very similar trend, except solar consumes slightly more amount of water pretty much everywhere around the country. So you do see improvements practically across the board. The red in our WSV solar is more of a signal of a lot of these counties that are already scarce of water, are already conscientious about this problem. And they're already utilizing energy generation technologies that don't consume a lot of water, right? So kind of the darker green areas are areas where we can maybe improve upon this. And one of the graphs that was really able to show this is this next graph here, where I take what's called the SWY and the Aware CF and I put it as a ratio. So I explained that Aware CF is the scarcity of water. SWY is a very similar concept, except it's specific to energy generation technologies. So basically, in generalized terms, where you see the green on here is where you see the biggest benefit from using on-site renewables in lowering the amount of water that's consumed, right? The red doesn't necessarily mean it's not better. I'm just trying to show what counties necessarily you see the most improvement. The next way I do that is by using a Pareto front. It's a fancy graph basically used to find more optimal points. On this Pareto front, I'm looking to find the most optimal points for not for water consumption, and a lot of these counties happen to be in really arid climates like Arizona, like California, and so on. When we move to carbon, it's a similar story in that it's pretty much better everywhere, and it's better by a lot. You're looking at a range of 20-25% improvement practically across the board. You do see a few counties where there are not improvements. They're kind of a statistical anomaly. Basically what it means is in these counties, I've utilized solar energy in this, and in these counties, it's currently utilizing energy generation technologies that are lower in a carbon footprint. So for example, wind and nuclear. But what happens is it's very common for electricity to obviously transmit across county borders. And it's very likely that in these counties they utilize a lot of energy generation technology around, and we think that in general it would be an improvement everywhere. When it comes to future work, one of the things I'm actually working on now is understanding this transmission of electricity. Obviously, we're kind of in one big grid, and the electricity produced in one place is generally used there, but it's not always. So what I'm looking to do is kind of understand how electricity is transferred around the United States. The way energy is tracked currently, it's really, really difficult to kind of understand exactly where energy is produced and where it's consumed. So I'm currently in the process of utilizing that and coupling it with this study. I want to thank a few people. Obviously, before I end here, I want to thank my research advisor, Dr. Umhoff. Again, I reached out to him my sophomore year, and I've been able to work with him in his lab for roughly 2.5 years now. And it's really kind of been a staple of my Villanova experience here, and I'm really looking forward to it. Obviously, I'm going to grad school and going to be continuing my research there, so it's been a profound impact on my career here at Villanova. I want to thank Michelle Gandy. She's in the geography department. She helped me understand some of the ArcGIS stuff, so I utilized that technology, and I wasn't very good with using the software system, so she really helped me kind of understand some of those things. I also want to acknowledge Victoria Martinet. She's a classmate of mine. She also happens to work in the MSAL lab under Dr. Umhoff. She had been working on a project very similar to mine when I first started. She gave me a lot of helpful tips and kind of put me in the right track with this study, so I do think it's worthy to acknowledge her. I also want to thank the NSF because my study was under an NSF grant in the MSAL laboratory, which is also part of the ES2 laboratory on Villanova's campus. I want to thank the College of Engineering, and as well I want to thank the Falvey Library for putting on this event today.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And so, congratulations. Thank you. And is Sean coming to take our picture? Yes, he is.
See what I don't understand. Look at that.
So you're going to grad school. Awesome.
I get to tell people where to go to lunch, try to explain the things that they don't know. So
It's a great place. Enjoy it.
I will.
It's work as well.
Thank you so much, guys.
Okay. So first you want to ask here. Okay. So, we're up to our last and final Falvey Scholar. So, unfortunately, Dr. Megan Quigley, who is the faculty mentor, is not able to be here tonight. So I'm going to read her introduction of Catherine. So, Catherine Messier's thesis, The Woman Behind the Words, a collaboration in 20th century literature, is an exceptional undergraduate research project. In her thesis, Catherine examines the way that words of the wives of famous authors were incorporated into their husbands' now canonical works and never given attribution. From stealing a phrase discussed over the dinner table to publishing a story with their names scratched over their wives, this appropriation has taken different forms, but Catherine's work, using archival research and intersectionist feminist theory, aims to restore the voices behind the words. Three quick reasons why Catherine's thesis is exceptional. First, research productivity. Catherine has made a wonderful use of Falvey's resources to examine the history of scholarship both of T.S. Eliot and F. Scott Fitzgerald. She also interviewed professors at other colleges, met with Sarah Wingo, the research librarian. Second, fearlessness. Catherine's feminist motivations have been clear since the beginning of this project. She's willing to take on not just historical misogyny, but but that at work in academia today. I hope that the quality won't dim as she enters the workforce and does further scholarship. Third, just the beginning. KATHLEEN will go from here to bring her knowledge to the T.S. Eliot International Summer School in Oxford for a fortnight. Here, now with other students, scholars, and professors throughout the world, she will continue to think about literary modernism, the power of institutions, and the history of publishing. It is exciting to think that this project is just the germ, thought-provoking, sophisticated, challenging as it is, just the germ of work that she will one day produce. Congratulations, KATHLEEN. Technology enabled to do it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Messier, and I'm a double major in English and Gender and Women's Studies. And my research is my undergraduate thesis project through the honors program here at Villanova, and it's titled The Woman Behind the Words, Collaborative Authorship in 20th Century Literature. While open collaborations between husbands and wives did exist in the 20th century, my research focuses on instances where husbands use their wives' words in their work without permission or acknowledgement, thereby appropriating rather than just collaborating. And specifically, my thesis focuses on two literary case studies of this type of appropriation. The first is T.S. Eliot's use of his wife Vivian's words, mainly in his poem The Wasteland. And the second is F. Scott Fitzgerald's use of his wife Zelda's words across his body of work, and I specifically examine his novels The Great Gatsby, The Beautiful and Damned, and The Side of Paradise. Sorry. Okay. So obviously from my introduction, my research focuses on white, male, canonized authors. So I wanted to take a minute to explain on why I would focus my research on such an exclusionary group. To start, these authors both wrote in the modernist time period, and to define what that means, modernist literature and modernism itself rose out of skepticism about romantic and classical values of art, literature, and life after World War I. And as a result, modernism was a very experimental genre that was really groundbreaking at the time. But despite that, it is today viewed as very problematic because the canon that it refers to is mainly white and male. But this paper does not study modernism to uplift the exclusionary canon, but rather to rewrite it. And so I am not studying just these white women to say that this is the only form of transgression that happened to female writers in the past. And I'm not trying to silence their non-canonized and non-white equivalents, whose words have not only been silenced, but also erased from history. To study those women would require a much more prolonged and in-depth research project, which has to unbury archives and research that have been hidden from history for so long. And rather, this project uses accessible research as a way to dive into that project of feminist recovery. Sorry, keep doing that. So a little bit about my research methods. My first is genetic criticism, which is the study of archives and manuscripts that trace the creation of a work of literature. So looking at letters, ledgers, diaries, anything that can trace the literal hand of both people collaborating on the page. However, because collaboration happens both on the page and in the imaginative space within a partnership, I also depend on the theory of critical fabulation, which was proposed by contemporary feminist philosopher Saidiya Hartman. And she defines it as an imaginative study of archival research that exposes the violence and conditions that have historically silenced people of color, which therefore calls for a reconstruction of these silent stories by exceeding history through examining things such as rumors, scandals, and chance events. And so I adopt this theory for my witness research by looking at things like
unrecorded dialogue or the editing process that might have lost some of these words, thinking about not only documented appropriation, but appropriation that happened that went undocumented as well. And in this way, by using this term from the knowledge of Black studies, by applying this to revising canon, it brings on a new revisionary goal, where revising canon is not just writing over work of scholars of the past, but rather extending on that work through newer progressive frameworks that have not always been available. Okay. Okay. So a little bit of my background of what I mean when I say like author and collaborator when I'm talking about this in my paper. To look at the definition of author, I first went back to the Enlightenment, where the idea of the self-determining genius rose. And because the Enlightenment was lifting up solitary male thinkers, as this idea spread to literature, the idea of the solitary male literary genius rose up. Men were the only ones writing, and there was no room for any form of collaboration with women with them. But then if we fast forward to the 1960s, philosophers Barthes and Foucault proposed the death of the autonomous author, and instead described authorship as subjective and collaborative. And I use this definition in my paper because it contextualizes the partnerships between both the Eliots and the Fitzgeralds. However, I do not entirely agree with this, and I argue that male literary genius, that idea, can still exist within collaborative authorship because of the patriarchal institutions which hold it up. And for this paper, I study the institutions of heterosexual marriage and the publishing industry. So looking at heterosexual marriage and the unequal power balance that has kind of always favored men within that, I took a specific look at how men have power over women's labor. And I looked at historical laws which say that a wife's wages literally belong to her husband. And in this way, the structure of heterosexual marriage gives men the financial and reputational power to usurp their women's words and erase their compensation and labor of writing. And to look at this in terms of the publishing industry, I researched both the history of literary reviews from 100 years ago to today to look at what kind of authors are being given prestige, and also the formation of canon and who we are uplifting as what needs to be read. And by looking at how these both developed over history, I definitely saw an improvement in the inclusion of women. But overall, these are still very male-dominated fields, and academia ascribes more prestige to male authors than their female counterparts. So in conclusion from this research, I argue that the interaction between heterosexual marriage, the publishing industry, and academic prestige as structures of patriarchy provided social, financial, and reputational support for male authors to appropriate their wives' words. And through studying case studies with close reading of these women's words and then scholarship on them today, which I'm not going to get into for time's sake, I argue that sexist and ableist ideology today continue to silence these women. And ultimately, I hope that my research fights to restore justice to these women by not only recognition in the present, but also a reimagination of the past, which acknowledges the significance of their words. Thank you.
Thank you. Color coordinating as well. So, I want to thank our last presenters for skipping Q&A. I'm sorry, I let us run a little long, but for those who are still here, you have additional questions. I encourage you to ask them as we hang around. So, I just want to thank you all for being here. I want to let you know that the presenters' research presentations will be in our distinctive collections digital library this summer. So that is an exciting thing for us. It's always, every year, I am so impressed by what our students are doing in their research. I've got to say, all of the speakers today were absolutely amazing. So please, there's more food, hang around and get to ask those questions that we weren't able to get to today. So thank you very much and have a great afternoon.